Good afternoon, everyone. I want to welcome you all to our webinar today. The theme is Strategic Alternatives, What to Do Before the Government Money Runs Out. I want to thank you all for being in attendance and hope you're all doing well. Those of you in the Bay Area, I know between COVID-19 and now with the recent fires, there's a lot of challenges out there in addition to the challenges that your businesses are facing from all the above. So in any respect, we've got a distinguished panel here today to help us talk about, what to do with regards to the, how to handle all these challenges, what the status is of kind of some of the current government programs, as well as some planning tools and, alternatives that are out there to look at beyond just what government money programs have been previously announced. I want to first introduce everyone on the panel here. I myself, Jerry Johnson, I'm a partner here at CFOs to Go. We're a fractional CFO firm that has over 20 partners covering different areas, service areas, and industries. We also have a search function where we can staff for a lot of different projects. And my area of focus is in the clean tech space. I've got about 30 years in renewable energy, clean water, clean air type of companies. Next, I want to introduce to you Richard Rogan. Richard, why don't you take it from here?
Thanks, Jerry. My name's Dick Rogan. I'm an attorney with Jeffer Mangels, Butler, and Mitchell in our San Francisco office, and I'm co-chair of the firm's bankruptcy and insolvency and restructuring department. I've practiced law in San Francisco for 45 years in this particular area, and I represented financial institutions, purchasers of assets out of distressed businesses, sellers of assets in a distressed business, receivers, assignees, you name it, we've done it. So happy to be aboard.
Very good. Thank you, Dick. Next, I'd like to introduce Joseph Weissglass.
Hi, everybody. Joe Weissglass with Configure Partners. I'm a managing director in our Atlanta office. I want to also thank Jerry for having me today. Configure Partners, we are a boutique investment bank focused in the middle market. We are industry agnostic, so we do everything from restaurants and retail to manufacturing and distribution and really everything in between. We are, however, very focused on our product, and our product is credit. So we look at ourselves as focused on credit and credit-driven transactions, which is euphemistic in many ways for restructuring in distress situations. So we'll talk about that as we get into the panel today. But at the end of the day, we advise borrowers on how to either raise new debt capital or borrowers and how to deal with stress, distress, restructuring situations that they may be encountering in a credit relationship that hasn't gone according to plan.
Thank you, Joseph. Before I introduce our next panelist, I do want to let everybody know we will be taking questions along the way. We hope to try and have questions that are pertinent to the topic at hand, since we're covering a few different areas. So use the Q&A feature in Zoom, and we will be reviewing those and trying to insert those in as we get through with the various parts of our program to make sure we've got ongoing dialogue here. Our next panelist is Derek Rosenstock. If you could please introduce yourself.
Yeah, Jerry, thank you very much for having me. So I've been in middle market lending for the greater part of 15 years, and I'm a managing director. As managing director, I lead CIBC Bank's regional office in Northern California, Pacific Northwest. My group and I are a national team. We help companies nationally maximize liquidity through custom structured lines of credit.
Hey, Derek.
How are you doing?
Could you get a little bit closer? We're not sure I can hear you that well.
Okay.
Sorry.
How about now? You okay?
A little better, yes.
Okay. So our unique credit offerings allow us to provide finance in the middle market, along with private equity sponsors that are looking at paying levels of liquidity that are generally higher than most commercial lenders are able to provide. So we're also able to finance acquisitions, turnarounds, and restructuring as well. So that'll be, and my role here is to talk about financing alternatives, which we'll get to in a little
Okay, Derek, I think we're still losing a little bit of you right now there, so you may want to try and get a little closer maybe with some headphones. Next, I'd like to introduce Joe Aloof.
Yes, good afternoon. Thanks for having me. I'm also a partner at CFOs to Go, and I lead two practice areas. One is the turnaround and restructuring, and the other one is the corporate finance and transformation. I've worked in my professional career with over 300 companies, helping them going through what they found themselves as difficult times. I've been involved in some well-known restructurings and turnarounds, and joined CFOs to Go about a year and a half ago to lead that practice. Thanks for having me.
Sure thing. Thank you, Joe. And in fact, first area that we're going to cover is kind of an overview of the current government programs, primarily those derived from the CARES Act. Joe, if you could kind of walk us through that, and then we'll certainly be looking for any questions on those and have others get involved as well.
Sure. So there are basically three programs that have been launched through the CARES Act. The first one was the PPP, which is structured in such a way that if accounted for correctly and properly, it could be subject to 100% forgiveness by the government. That program right now is closed, may become open, they may come back with another PPP, and at that point there'll be additional funds available. But that program is closed, and now most companies that have made use of that program are going through the process of accounting for the items that would then qualify for up to, as I said, 100% forgiveness. The second program is the EIDL, which is more of the disaster relief program through the SBA. That's a program that I personally believe that every company should apply for, because it's a fairly straightforward process. And one of the first things that happen, you get a $10,000 grant, up to $10,000 grant up front. And it's easy to apply. It's then translates into a loan that can have very attractive terms. I don't want to go into the details right now, but certainly if there are specific questions, I can address them later. The third one is what's called the Main Street Lending Program. It has three components. And I want to emphasize a couple of things related to that program, because there's been some confusion in the sense that people companies thought that this is really applicable to much larger companies, and that's not the case. So the essence of the program is really to make funds available to companies that were relatively healthy in 2019. So that's kind of the first condition. And it's predicated on EBITDA. So if you had positive EBITDA in 2019, and as long as that EBITDA, let's say, is about $40,000, which is a low threshold, you are eligible to participate in one of those three options that are available under the Main Street Lending Program. It's very attractive. It can be done on a secured or an unsecured basis. It can be in conjunction with existing debt. It has all sorts of very interesting features, but it's a very complicated program to apply for and to become eligible for. And the important part associated with that program is that a borrower can borrow up to 6 times 2019 EBITDA. So that can really result in a significant amount of additional borrowing capacity, again, through this program that can come in conjunction with existing debt. So that's kind of the summary of the three CARES Act lending facilities that have been made available.
Okay, thank you, Joe. One of the things I would like to add, because I know there's been a lot of talk about the PPP program and it's gotten a lot of headlines. As Joe mentioned, the extension of the PPP program through the PPP Flex Act was all the way until August 8th. It's now closed. Congress is, amongst the various things they're debating right now and going going back and forth on is potentially extending that and potentially giving companies that have already applied a second second bite at the apple, if you will. But that remains to be seen. Obviously, with Congress, nothing's final until it's signed by the president. Another thing to kind of also share with people, especially those that have already gotten the PPP loan, is that in terms of the forgiveness application, while the SBA did open up their window to start accepting the applications from the banks as of August 10th, last Monday, most, if not all, the banks that we've been in touch with so far said they're waiting to actually start processing applications until Congress passes their next legislation, because in many cases they're expecting that there will be some language included in there affecting the forgiveness, potentially allowing, say, borrowers with $150,000 loans or less to be automatically forgiven, thereby making the forgiveness application process a lot simpler. Nothing has been determined, time will tell, but that is one thing for those companies that are looking to get their applications in and process quickly. That will likely delay it a bit, just because banks are trying to do this efficiently as possible. And with the rules still being written by Congress and ultimately the SBA and Treasury, they're waiting right now to kind of get more information before opening up the window and actually being able to process those applications. But nonetheless, for all the firms that have had the loans extended through the program, it is worthwhile getting your records in place, especially payroll records, to be able to be ready for it so that when the window opens, you have the opportunity to process sooner than later. Next, I'd like to pass it on to Dick Rogan to talk about kind of developing a clear view of your financial future.
Thanks, Jerry. Of course, before you can develop a clear view of your financial future, you need to know what your financial present is like. Basically, you have to look in a mirror. You need to get the facts and put them together in a way that you can use them for your own sake in managing your business, but also use them with your experts or consultants that you might need to bring on, and ultimately with your bankers. So the first thing you want to do is remember the number one rule that we have in any kind of a workout, and that is that cash is king. This is all about cash. It's all about generating cash, preserving cash, and making sure you have enough cash to take you from where we are today to whenever we go back to some level of normality. And to find out where we are today, we need to prepare current financial statements. So do that, please, on a cash basis, if you will. Have your cash on hand, your accounts receivable, the good ones, usually those that are within 60 days, and any other assets you might have that might be liquidated, turned into cash, like inventory or some of your other equipment or things like that. You also need to quantify your liabilities, and you need to know exactly what do you owe, who do you owe it to, when is the payment due, what are the accounts payable that you have, what do they look like in terms of an aging, and then the other thing I think it's always a good thing to do is to run a UCC search on your own business so you can find out exactly what type of collateral did you pledge, because sometimes businesses don't keep good records and forget what they pledged and to whom. So this way you can go to your state, your Secretary of State, because UCCs are filed in your own state, state of organization, go to that state and get the UCC filing and find out where you stand. From this information, the next thing to do is to run what I call a liquidation analysis. And these are things, by the way, that your banker would do as well when you get around to meeting with him or her. So you want to run a liquidation analysis and you want to have two questions. What would happen if we liquidated the business immediately? And what would happen if we sold the business in an orderly fashion? And you sit down and you take a look at your assets and try to get rough numbers there to figure out how things will work. That's not to say you're going to sell the business, but you're going to use this as an anchor, as some way to make sure that things actually work. I'm being told my internet connection might be unstable, but you're all still getting me, right?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay,
Yep.
good. All right, the next thing you do is look at your cash flow. And here's where we use an age-old tool that people who do what the people on this panel do have used forever and a day, and that's a 13-week rolling cash flow projection or forecast. So week by week, you start with cash on hand, you deal with the sources of your cash, you're gonna sell some assets, you're gonna collect some receivables, where's the cash coming from? Maybe loan proceeds, it could be. And then you go next to uses of cash. You're gonna spend it on paying rent, you're gonna pay taxes, you're gonna pay your employees, you're gonna fund retirement plans, whatever, you're gonna buy more inventory, whatever you might do. And you do that week by week, and that's how you come up with a 13-week rolling cash flow forecast. In these days, we have a lot of people who have a very unusual problem. Typically in my business, I'm dealing with people who whose problem is too much debt and they have some revenue. Today, we often have people who don't have very much debt, but what they have is zero revenue or very little revenue. You still have to do this forecast and try to figure out what your cash positions are going to look like, because that's what you and your consultants are going to use to try to get you out of this problem. Next, you want to have your loan documents reviewed if you have them. Best way to do that is to ask an attorney who's familiar with loan documents, somebody who does commercial legal practice, someone who understands the Uniform Commercial Code. You want to find out also if you have any covenant defaults and if you have any assets that are unencumbered, in other words, not covered by somebody's security interest. And then the questions we have, that we're going to work on. Can we improve or speed up our account receivable collections? Sometimes a simple phone call to one of your good customers will bring some money in a little faster than you thought. You might need to give them a little discount, but it might be the cheapest way you can get money in the door. The second way would be, can you slow down or delay accounts payable? Again, if you're a long-time customer, these days people will work with you. Give them a chance to do that. Next, do you have some assets you don't need? Can you sell those assets? Maybe you even want to consider selling your company at this time if it's in the right industry and there's a demand for whatever it is your company does. And then you have to look at the hard decisions. What kind of cuts can you do? Can you reduce the amount of income you're carrying? Can you negotiate with your landlord? And frankly, very sad, can you perhaps do something with your staff to where you might have to make some cuts in staff, either salaries or in positions. And then finally, you're going to want to talk to your banker. And when you talk to your banker, you're going to want to be prepared. So you're going to need help. You're going to need consultants, like the things that Joe mentioned. You're going to need somebody like that to work with you. You might need a CPA. You probably have one already, but you want to make sure your records and the things you're going to present to the banker are in good shape. You want to have insolvency counsel, somebody like me who knows what your real alternatives are and whether you can bluff or whether you can take another tactic if you have to do that, but without selling the business down the river. And then finally, you may need to have a broker or an auctioneer if you have some excess equipment or real estate that you want to sell. That's a very, very fast run through on on how one gets a clear view of a financial future. But essentially, those are the things that you have to look at.
Okay, well, very good. Thank you, Dick. Definitely a lot to contemplate there and some things we could certainly unpack a little bit further later on with some questions. Next, I'd like to pass it on to Derek, and he's going to talk about different financing alternatives.
Sure. Today, I thought we could look at financing alternatives for companies that are in the middle market segment of the economy. Many financial institutions kind of define the middle market a little bit differently, but for this discussion, let's define the segment as 5 million up to 500 million in revenue. Now, for discussion purposes, we can use a middle market food manufacturing company that processes, say, canned vegetables, and maybe they sell it through e-commerce, retail, and food service channels. The company has traditionally maintained a top line annual revenue figure of, say, 60 million and is marginally profitable. So now let's layer in impacts from COVID that have caused supply chain issues as well as processing plant closures. So companies moving along, great. Maybe they didn't have a 13-week cash flow, they probably should have, but now COVID's upon you. And what happens? Well, the company will likely have a slump in revenue and may or may not be profitable on a trailing 12-month basis. Okay, we got an issue here. In this situation, the company has a line of credit with a large commercial bank with 3 to 4 covenants that are structured off of the balance sheet and EBITDA or cash flow. As COVID impacted the business, the company could have obtained several months of capital for payroll and rents from the PPP loans. During this period, the drop in revenue and EBITDA may have caused covenant violations, issues with monitoring, and now the commercial bank is wondering what's going on. So as quarters roll in after the March reporting cycle, the commercial bank notices that the company not only is in default of covenants, but maybe even lost a customer. So in this situation is pretty common at this point in time, and the company should evaluate their working capital partner. And this leads us into our discussion around alternatives. So the company could hire a debt advisor to leverage their network, or decide to begin alternative partner conversations on their own. So the first alternative is to begin conversations with commercial banks. Commercial banks are not all the same. So it isn't simply you go to a bank and they're going to look at credit the same way. That's just not the same. That's just not the case. So if you're with a commercial bank today, it might be worth it to start conversations with other commercial banks if you find yourself in an issue with covenant violations and maybe special assets groups are following your account along with the relationship manager. That's the time to start conversations. An alternative to this is that you can choose to work with a bank asset-based lender like CIBC that will most likely have appetite for a company that might not be profitable. The asset-based lender will structure a line of credit based on the company's working capital and fixed assets generally. This is advantageous because EBITDA or cash flow is not the focus as it generally is with many commercial lenders. The asset-based lender can kind of allow you to get through the rough cycle and turn the ship back around, if you will. So a lot of the commercial lenders are not, they don't underwrite to the assets, they're more so underwriting to your cash flow, which was impacted by COVID or the loss of a customer. So kind of next up, kind of down the line here is the non-bank asset-based lending options. These lenders would be firms like Encina Business Credit or Sienna Lending Group. The difference here is that the lender will likely not have covenants, but will likely charge interest rates in the low double digits. While you might think that pricing is high, it is generally in line with the risk that's out there. These non-bank lenders will likely not finance term loans, so you have to figure out what you're going to do with your real estate mortgages, and tend to shy away from fixed assets depending on where you're at in your turnaround cycle. The final kind of route here to unlock liquidity based on working capital assets would be to work with a factoring company. Factoring firms such as LSQ and TCI Business Capital can provide AR financing as well as invoice factoring. The factoring companies help businesses meet obligations and grow by purchasing the receivables and advancing a percentage of the invoice amount on the same day. So once the invoice is paid, your factoring company remits the remaining balance to you, less a small fee called the factoring fee. So those are kind of as you're entering into risk, you know, you have a few options there. I definitely would say that you either want to start your own conversations with commercial banks and maybe bank asset-based lenders, even non-bank lenders, or go out to configure partners like Joe and you know, look for debt advisory, because the name of the game is knowing the market and being able to have somebody in your back pocket when you need it. Because what you don't want to do is think, oh, this is the month that I'm turning around. Well, that month passes you by, and now it's a quarter. Now it's 2 quarters. And then pretty soon, Richard's being called to, you know, liquidate the business and possibly selling your assets off. So you don't want to let it get too far outside of your ability to control what's going on. So that's what I have on alternatives.
Very good. Thank you, Derek. And seems like a good tee up there for Joseph to talk about corporate transformation and various programs there.
Great. Thanks, Derek. That was a good segue. You know, for everybody listening in, I'll say we are one of the debt advisors, right, that Derek mentioned. We do everything from debt capital for healthy businesses to debt capital for stressed or distressed businesses, often called rescue financing. And then also do just outright restructurings, which is really what I've been asked to talk most about today. You know, in reality, those things exist on a continuum, exist on a spectrum. We often explore more than one of those alternatives at the same time, explore them in parallel. But really, from a restructuring perspective, 3 strategies that I'll hit on today. Broadly speaking, there's what we would call a restructuring or balance sheet restructuring or reorganization, depending on who you're talking to. There are asset sales and there are acquisitions. This is another point where I'll stop and say, in reality, in practice, the solution is often some combination or permutation of these 3 strategies. It's not as though you explore just one of the 3. In most instances, typically you're bringing multiple elements together into a fulsome, holistic style solution. And it's really not a one-size-fits-all type evaluation either. There are a lot of factors that come into play. Some are specific to the borrower, to the company. Some are specific to the lender or lenders. Some are exogenous to the constituents that are in the capital structure at the time, you know, that were brought in. And so it really is a very bespoke solution. And it's, you know, it's a bit of a process to come to the solution there. But we'll work very closely with guys like Dick, guys like Joe, and then ultimately guys like Derek as well when the restructuring plan calls for new capital. But, you know, first I'd say on the restructuring side, really outside of restaurants, retail, hospitality, maybe a few other sectors, we're not yet seeing that dramatic surge in restructuring activity that the mainstream news would have you believe is out there. There's a moderate uptick in activity. We're clearly busy, but it's mostly, I think, because of the various stimulus programs that we've discussed, a lot of the real stress or distress or triggers for actual transactions have been pushed down the road. I think we expect to see a more serious surge in that activity later in 2020 and early 2021 as that stimulus subsides. But at the end of the day, we do think it's prudent to start planning for what happens when that capital stops coming, when the liquidity, the stimulus dries up. We do think it's prudent to start planning ahead of that point in time as far as what is the ultimate solution here. You know, as we all know, everybody knows on the phone, options have value, and they have value for a reason. We've heard of a few of us hit on liquidity in different ways, but at the end of the day, starting to plan early will allow owners of stressed businesses to maximize the value of those stressed businesses, to protect the value of those stressed businesses prior to the point in time when they're out of liquidity. Because when you're out of liquidity, as Dick said, cash is king. When you're out of liquidity, you're out of options. And your option set as the owner of a distressed business dramatically smaller, and the prospects for a good outcome much lower. So I'd say, right now we are working with numerous borrowers on how to navigate the process, how to navigate conversations with lenders. Again, the strategies are very bespoke. It's very fact specific, but generally speaking, I would say management teams like to or often equate the word restructuring with Chapter 11, and that's not nearly always the case. Chapter 11 is a tool, but it is a very expensive tool, and the benefits need to outweigh the costs. I think some of you may have turned your head at me a little funny when I said the benefits of Chapter 11, but there are some benefits of Chapter 11. But it is a tool. It's expensive. We try to help our clients avoid it the best we can, unless it's really necessary. I'd say also, Chapter 11 is not a destination in and of itself. It is a pathway. It is a journey. Having a view to how you exit Chapter 11 and what is a long-term plan is really a vital element to deciding how it is you go into Chapter 11. That's really all I'm going to say about Chapter 11, because again, the majority of the activity for us is really on an out-of-court basis. Most of our clients are middle market clients. Chapter 11 is expensive for mega cap clients. It's particularly expensive, relatively speaking, for middle market clients. And then typically the capital structures for the clients that we're working with, they're simple enough that we can effectuate most, if not all, of the same relief on a consensual out-of-court basis with a negotiated outcome amongst the constituents without ever really bringing Chapter 11 into the dialogue. And so our current engagements really are focused on how to restructure the existing debt capital, sometimes to allow for new equity capital to come into the distressed situation, again, all on an out-of-court basis, in exchange for resetting covenants, reducing the face value of the debt, reducing the debt service, enhancing the liquidity. Sometimes we're bifurcating the existing note and bringing in, or converting, I should say, a portion of that debt into an equity-like security, getting a preferred return on the new capital. We're also evaluating, to Joe Alouf's point, we're evaluating Main Street actually as a tool in some of these restructurings where you can bring new, lower cost debt capital to the equation, partially satisfy your outstanding debt, maybe pay it off at a discount in certain instances, not all instances, but certain instances. And I've just rattled off a whole host of different considerations, and it really is just illustrative as to how fact specific or bespoke, to use those words again, the restructuring outcomes are. The asset sales, a little bit more straightforward, and you can look at an asset sale as a sale of the entire business or a sale of non-core assets. Typically, you're looking at least on the non-core asset side of things, you're looking at selling assets to raise the liquidity that we've all been talking about in order to bridge to some sort of recovery, liquidating unused equipment, consolidating facilities, selling real estate, that sort of thing. I would caution you all to be very focused on your credit agreement. In this instance, selling assets that are collateral, and this is near and dear to Derek's heart in particular, that are collateral of your lenders, that doesn't actually necessarily generate liquidity for you in the traditional sense, as your lender will often have a lien on those assets and a lien on that cash, and you may not have the ability to redraw that cash once you've been forced to pay down your lenders pursuant to the credit agreement. Acquisitions, it probably seems a little bit counterintuitive, but this is a very, very good time, if you are well capitalized, to be acquisitive. And we have a handful of both sponsored and non-sponsored businesses that are pursuing acquisitions right now. Again, if you have the capital, the traditional approach is just to approach and buy the company, but moments of stress and distress like what we're seeing right now, or dislocation like we're seeing right now, also introduce opportunities to acquire the debt of a business and employ kind of a loan to own strategy on a strategic basis. It's not very common, but it does happen. And in moments like this is when it's successful typically. But again, that's high level, many of the different strategies and some of the different considerations as far as employing those strategies when you start thinking about real corporate transformation opportunities in a distress context.
Okay, well, thank you, Joseph. So we have time for questions at this point. A couple that have come in. One, I'll just to paraphrase, he was basically saying based on their current conditions, they're looking for what other additional government funds or programs are out there that don't need to be repaid. From my own perspective, I know we've talked about the PPP. Until Congress comes up with something else that would either be PPP2 or something like that, there's nothing available in that. That program has expired. As well, the EIDL program, which is not free money, but it is, it does have the structure to be able to defer payment for a year, and the interest rates are relatively low at 3.75%. That program has been fully subscribed, and the grants that were associated with the $10,000 up to $10,000 grants that Joe mentioned, that also has been fully subscribed. So as far as I'm aware, and others please pipe in, the programs that were put out there as part of the CARES Act at this point have been basically used up or expired in their timeline, and there isn't anything else available government-wise at the moment to be able to provide any kind of grant-like funds that I'm aware of.
Jerry, if I may, that's correct. I wanted to mention something about the Main Street programming that I didn't talk about before, and that is under certain circumstances, loans under the Main Street lending program can be used to pay off other existing debt. So back to Derek's kind of comments and also Dick's, if you have banks breathing down your neck, this is an option that's definitely worth pursuing. And again, the important aspect of it is that you can literally borrow up to 6 times your 2019 EBITDA. So that's pre-COVID, and significant amount of leverage can be added that would mean kind of new liquidity.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that too, under the MSLP, that while you're still ultimately borrowing the funds through a bank, and you will have to go through their credit standards, the way the program is set up is that the Fed's special purpose vehicle is assuming 95% of that. So it does basically allow for the banks to be, I won't say more risk tolerant, but they certainly have less skin in the game than they would if they were making the loan just directly off their own balance sheet. It allows them to be able to have most of that be replenished on their balance sheet to go and lend to other things. So that provides some potentially additional, I won't necessarily credit enhancement, but it certainly does make it potentially more attractive.
Yeah, I would just one reaction or one addition to that for everybody who's listening in as it relates to Main Street. I think we've spoken to 120 Main Street lenders in the last 2 weeks. They are all swamped, to say the least, with applications. Resources are stretched incredibly thin. As of Wednesday of last week, 13 Main Street loans had been funded nationwide. So if this is an avenue that you're interested in exploring, you need to get in line. You need to get your application in sooner rather than later. Expect long processing times.
Got it.
I'd like to add as well that a lot of lenders are not, they are not providing the loans to non-customers. So, you might have to call a few banks, plus then you're gonna have the waiting lines too.
Very good. Another question that had come up with regards to, if you have existing debt and the loan covenants, and, if you're reporting on a monthly or quarterly basis, certainly in quarterly, you're beginning to kind of have the Q2 numbers showing default or potential defaults there. What would be some recommendations from the group in terms of how to approach your bank to be able to negotiate either some kind of extension or other things to get some relief from those covenants to be able to work with the existing lenders, especially if there's not a lot of other resources from the banking perspective that might be immediately available?
Well, Jerry, right now, the regulators who of course, all the commercial banks and others have to, have to deal with on their side of this. The regulators have expressed the point that the banks can not be as strict as they might usually be. Whatever that means remains to be seen. And a good chief credit officer is going to be very, very wary of those kind of statements, because today they say, fine, go ahead, you can pretend and then extend the loan, but the end of the next quarter, maybe we're not going to think that was a good idea. So the best thing you can do, as I said earlier today, was be prepared. Make sure that you've done your homework, that you don't walk into the bank's office disheveled with a bunch of papers in a shoebox. Make sure you've got your papers ready to go, your financials up to date, and have some idea as to what you think is going to happen in your business going forward and how it compares to normal years. So for instance, the food manufacturer that Derek mentioned, that may be a seasonal business. And right now we see a lot of problems in seasonal agriculture in California because in large part because of lack of labor. We have lots of other issues here too. Some weather issues are developing as well. But those guys are seasonal and they have seasonal needs, and their bankers should be used to servicing them on a seasonal basis. For people who aren't so seasonal or whose season may be in the fourth quarter, you still need to bring in comparisons with the way it looked normally and go in and show your banker what you've got, and then give them some ideas to how you plan to get from where we are today to build a bridge to get to next year. How long do you think it's going to last? Do you think this, and you have to make an assumption. Nobody has a crystal ball. One of my partners who does what I do has a crystal ball on his desk, only it's cloudy. Can't see through it. And, that's kind of what we tell people. So we make the best educated guesses or estimates as to where we think things are going to be. And we say to ourselves, how are we going to get past this time? We're a travel company. We're a summer camp company. We don't have any revenue this year. How are we going to keep the infrastructure afloat to be able to go to next year? Certainly you've thought that through. You've run your business. You've run it successfully for many, many years. You're a very important part of the team. But what you don't know is how to deal with these difficult problems that we're facing now. And there's where you need to pick up the phone and call someone to help you get your presentation ready before you go speak to bankers. And Derek's point was, of course, correct about the commercial bankers. They're not all the same. Start with your own bank, but you might have a few others you want to talk to, and then find somebody who can help you weed through what other types of financing might be available. But it's very, very important to be prepared in this day and age.
Yeah, I'd like to add this one thing. If definitely want to go prepared. Let the banker know what's happened. Don't try to hide behind it, and don't try to think that it's going to go away, because it won't, because the financials will come out later and then questions will be asked, what happened? And right now, they have to speak to their credit groups about your account and the way that you're performing. So if they don't have the right information, then it may not benefit you in the long term to not bring that information to the table, because they won't be able to basically speak about your business at this time. And I think the first thing that you want to do is go in there and get your waiver letter, because if they don't waive it, then there's going to be an issue with the covenant violation down the road. Yes, banks are, from a regulatory perspective, are given a little bit of leeway here, but once again, there's no formal definition on that. If that turns and now they have to then report all of those that are in covenant violations, or there's some change there, you know, you're going to have to move relatively quick as they shift you to like a special assets group if you're truly hemorrhaging, if your business is damaged. So I'll leave that there.
Yeah, I think I'd add a couple more points that, and most of these have been made in different ways previously, and Derek may cringe when you hear me say this, but you know, at the end of the day, all of the activity that you take when you start approaching a stress or distress situation, it's anchored in the alternative set that's available not only to you as an owner of the business, but to the lenders as a lender to the business. And having a very, very strong assessment of what that alternative set is going to ground your response to your banker, the special assets group, in some sort of what is the best alternative type analysis. The you know, the other point I will make is that your bankers are people too. And so making sure that they are informed, being as candid as you can possibly be with them. Don't put them in a position to look bad within their organization because you've not fully disclosed something to them, or you haven't been fully candid with them. You know, the most contentious, difficult situations we've ever been involved with start with some level of lack of full transparency, lack of communication, and it takes a long time to recover from that. I don't think anybody questions that what we're dealing with right now is unprecedented, and so it is okay to admit that there are challenges in the situation, and there's also, to Dick's point, it's okay to admit that you don't have full clarity on the future, and have that sort of candid conversation with your banker.
Jerry, the only thing I would add to all these excellent points is don't do it yourself. It's most of the time, it's the first time that you've ever faced a situation like this. And because you need to be prepared, you need to have a plan, you need to have a tactic, hire a professional to help you. And because those of us that have done it many times, often they know the financial institution, they know the players, and the approach may be very different than if you were to do it yourself.
I would definitely second that. I mean, I've having been in the situation of being an advisor as well as also being in the CFO role, relationships matter. I mean, when you think about it, as you know, it's been pointed out, I mean, you've got a lot of individuals, you know, in stressful time like this, all the banks are finding that their clients are challenged, or many of their clients are challenged. And, you know, there's only going to be so many resources available when you think about what the banks are going through. Not that you're going to feel sorry for them, sorry guys, but ultimately, you know, they're basically trying to maintain a client base. They've got the PPP program kind of thrust upon them, which has created a lot of fire drills. You know, the Main Street Lending Program has also kind of got its own fire drill, and it really does help to be able to have, you know, a trusted advisor be able to help cut through some of the noise, to be able to talk to the right people that can make decisions on these things, and ultimately have a credible plan. I mean, certainly sooner is better than later in terms of talking to the banks, because the more time that you give them, the more time that you can give yourself towards looking towards options, the more likely they are to kind of work with you and help manage it, because ultimately the banks are not trying to write off or write down loans or put you into, you know, a distressed assets group. That doesn't make them look good if they're the relationship manager. So they're trying to figure out how to make this thing work, but they have to work with good information and be, you know, somebody that basically understands what the rules of the game are and be able to kind of work through that. So that's definitely an important step. One thing I would also like to bring up, just kind of thinking about this with regards to the PPP program, because I know it's come up, we've worked with a number of clients in getting the loans and also helping them go through the forgiveness process, that I think the tenor of things have changed as they adjusted the program to have an 8-week forgiveness to now up to 24-week forgiveness. And some of the rules have changed in terms of if you laid off people or you had reductions in their wages for a period of time and the restoration of that. And I think it's important because ultimately, you know, the idea of getting a free money is great, but don't let the tail wag the dog here. And that you want to get the forgiveness, but rushing to try and, fulfill the terms of saying it's got to be spent on these things in this period of time, especially when it was focused on the 8-week period. And it's like the money comes in, you're spending it all on wages. And it's not to say you don't want to take care of your employees, but if ultimately you basically spend all the money that comes in as soon as it comes in and paying the payroll under the same conditions that you had before the COVID hit, you'll find that you basically no better off, 10, 12 weeks down the road when that 2.5 months worth of payroll comes in through the PPP program. And while for a lot of you, the money's come in long enough ago that those decisions have been made, for those of you that have gotten more recently, you really need to be thinking about that 13-week cash forecast, and really probably looking out beyond that. I mean, you should be looking 6 to 12 months, because realistically, until a vaccine comes out, for many industries, there's going to be an impact. And even then, who knows how long it's going to take before you really see the full relief and kind of back to normal, if there is such a thing. From that, you should really be thinking about, okay, what do I need to do to kind of get through as long as I can? And if it means having to do some layoffs, production and wages, I mean, I've got a couple clients that have basically instituted 40% pay cuts across the board. No one's happy about it, but to the extent that they believe in the company and there's an opportunity down the road to potentially see it through and have a job on the other side, those are things that you may have to do, with the idea that while those potentially hamper you in being able to get full forgiveness, the way the rules have been extended now, that if you restore the headcount reductions or the pay cuts by the end of the year, you still have a safe harbor provision that allows you to still get full forgiveness. So really be looking out beyond just the next 4 to 6 weeks, 13 weeks even. You're really looking out through the end of this year into next and say, if things stay like they are or don't get better enough, is there a plan that I can come up with in terms of squeezing things down, whether it be in terms of layoffs or pay cuts or a combination of both, that can allow me to eke through? You really need to do something you consider. And you can't just put it off the board because you're saying, well, I got this money from PPP to be able to pay payroll, I need to use it for that. It's like, well, to get full forgiveness, that's true. But if the business is basically runs out of money before the end of the year because things didn't come back together and we paid all that, while it's certainly a good thing that you pay the people that you could when you could, if the business is gone and they lose their jobs, I mean, are they any better off? So really, the financial health of the company has got to be something as a business owner you're looking at as much as anything. And you really need to be kind of thinking about this longer term plan and the scenario planning that others have talked about, and saying, what's the path forward and can I get to the other side in some form or fashion to have a business that's still left. Okay. One other item that had come up that I wanted to circle back to was, in terms of looking at some of these different restructuring opportunities and options, I mean, what's a normal timeline for that? I mean, what do we see as, if you're thinking about this scenario planning and you are trying to, figure out at what point would I see money coming in from this? What's a realistic set of assumptions there? Because that's also part of the planning process to say, well, when do I need to turn this on?
So Dick, I'll go first, and I'll be, feel free to jump in and disagree with me. Typically speaking, restructurings on average are a 6-month process. And there are moments when they go faster than that. And I've closed restructurings that were 3 years in the making as well. And that's also the exception. But it's about 6 months to get up to speed, develop your plan, propose your plan, negotiate through the back and forth of your plan, and then document the plan.
Yeah, that's right. If you get into a bankruptcy case, for instance, and now we have the new subchapter S bankruptcy under the CARES Act, it's been extended for small businesses, which they define as up to 7.5 million of aggregate debt, that you can basically drag the debt out for as long as 5 years if you're a borrower and you meet that criteria. I agree with Joe before. It's always better not to go file a bankruptcy case if you can do it out of court. An out of court Chapter 11 type case is always the best way to handle it. because you have lots of flexibility and you can do pretty much what you need to do. Once you get into bankruptcy, the wheels of justice are turning ever so slowly these days. Very, very slow. It can take months to get a hearing. And frankly, that can just kill a business just sitting there waiting. So really the best thing to do is to try to work with your advisors and try to bring everybody together. And maybe today we can't put everybody in a room, give them coffee and lock the doors until they come out with a solution, because that's what we always used to say we'd do. But today I guess you have to make them sit there on Zoom until their eyes get blurry. But whatever it is, you've got to sit down and do the hard work and try to identify the various different interests that are in your deal. Do you have a secured lender? Do you have equity investors? Do you have mezzanine debt? Do you have a real estate issue with the landlord? Do you have, what kind of supplier issues do you have? Because today you could have all these things and a lack of revenue. You have to take the time to be prepared and get ready to go, no matter how small or large your company is. And then, as Joe says, you go in there, if you have somebody who knows where the sources of money might be, you can get it done in a relatively modest period of time. If you're out there prospecting for gold, you could be sitting there with your pan looking for gold flecks for a long, long time. So that's basically the way we see it.
Yeah, I think if I can emphasize one thing here is that you need to have some significant amount of cash available or ready to come in order to get through a bankruptcy process. And so it's not a solution by itself.
Well, that's right. In order to have a real decent sized Chapter 11 case, you are talking about, just to get started into 6 figures of cash for retainers and other things. Smaller companies, you can do it for less. Depends on where it is, of course, also. But you're talking about very substantial fees, not just legal fees, but other fees in the Chapter 11 process. So again, if you can do it some other way, that's always the first choice. And there are other ways and other procedures that you might use I always like to talk about how many arrows are in my quiver. And what I want my clients to do is come to me when I still have arrows in my quiver. Don't come to me when there's 1 arrow left and I've got to shoot that bullseye or else, because somebody, might move the target while I'm at it. So very, very important. Again, you've got a problem, take a stiff drink or whatever it is you like to do, and then sit down, buckle up, figure out the facts, get the people you need to help you, and move forward. It's not going to go away all by itself.
Very good. Well, we have about 1 or 2 minutes left. I wanted to just give the panelists any opportunities for final thoughts before we wrap it up. Derek, do you want to start? Anything?
I would just reiterate the fact that, you want to be active in, finding liquidity, especially at a tough time, and don't wait thinking it's just going to get better. My bank's going to work with me. Well, that might be the case. I wouldn't leave it up to chance, as banks are also a business as well, and their businesses are changing, and some banks are not lending, some are de-risking, so you never know what cycle your bank is in, because it's going to be difficult for a relationship manager to tell you exactly what's going on, and I don't think that that's going to happen in many cases. So, you got to take the initiative and talk to Joe, or Richard.
Okay. Joe Loof, any final thoughts?
I would just emphasize the options. And even in times like today, there are plenty of options that we heard through the panel today, options through the government, and there are always alternatives. So As dire as you may think the situation is, seek a professional that can really walk you through what the alternatives are.
Got it. Joseph?
So I think we've hit on a lot of the points. I think one that I'll leave everybody with is psychological in nature. I mean, there are three types of people or three types of reactions in stressful situations: people who ignore the fire, people who run from the fire, and people who run to the fire. And I can tell you from a career of doing this, if you're somebody who runs to the fire, you will have a better outcome than either of the other two types of people.
Very good. Richard, final thoughts.
We're living in unprecedented times in terms of dealing with credit markets and commercial credit and real estate credit. It's almost exactly the opposite of what we've had many times in the past during crises. We've got low interest rates, not high interest rates, but we've got very low revenue. We need to be realistic, as Joe just said, run to the fire. But first, put on your asbestos suit, please. Get prepared, and then go to work. It won't be easy, but usually your bankers are not looking for one more problem. And if you can help them, and I think Derek's point was this, if you can help them, not have to report something a little bit squirrely, you've gone a long way. You want to give them the truth, sit down with them, and try to find a solution. And that takes a lot of time and effort and skill. And anyway, good luck. That's all I can say right now. We'll all get through this one way or another.
Very good. All right. Well, thank you, panelists. Appreciate all your time and thoughts here. Everyone on the webinar, I appreciate you for participating and attending. And if you have any further questions, you can certainly reach out to us. Each of us on the panel here are certainly available for future conversation and engagement, and would love to be able to help you in any way we can. So thank you all and stay safe. Thank you.
Thanks, Jerry.
Yep.